Officer Bradley Ross shoved the 68-year-old man against the courthouse wall, his voice dripping with contempt as he sneered, "You people think you can just walk in here like you own the place." What Bradley didn't know was that the elderly man in the worn brown jacket wasn't just any witness. He was Luther Gray, father of Navy SEAL Commander Stephen Gray, who had spent the last 15 years hunting terrorists in the world's most dangerous places. And when Stephen received the call about what happened to his father, he realized it was time to bring those same skills home to Charleston County Courthouse. Which state do you live in? Have you ever seen someone your father's age treated like they were invisible, like their dignity meant nothing to the system they served their whole lives? The morning had started like any other Tuesday for Luther Gray. He'd taken his diabetes medication with breakfast, pressed his brown suit jacket the way his late wife Margaret had taught him 30 years ago, and walked the 6 blocks from his small house on Maple Street to the Charleston County Courthouse. At 68, Luther still maintained the erect posture of the Marine sergeant he'd been 4 decades earlier, though his steps moved slower now, and his hands sometimes trembled when his blood sugar dropped too low. Luther wasn't at the courthouse for himself. His neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, had asked him to be a character witness in her grandson's trial. The boy had made mistakes. Luther knew that. But he also knew that 19-year-old Malik Carter wasn't the hardened criminal the prosecutor was painting him to be. Luther had watched Malik grow up, had seen him help elderly neighbors with their groceries, had witnessed the young man's quiet struggles with a system that seemed determined to see him fail from the moment he'd been born in the wrong neighborhood with the wrong skin color. The courthouse lobby buzzed with the usual Tuesday morning activity. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried past with their briefcases, their heels clicking against the marble floor in rhythms that spoke of billable hours and important clients. Families clustered on wooden benches, their faces carrying the weight of whatever legal drama had brought them there. Court clerks moved with practiced efficiency, their arms full of files that represented lives hanging in the balance. Luther approached the security checkpoint with the same careful attention he'd applied to everything in his life. He removed his keys, his wallet, the small container that held his insulin and glucose tablets. The metal detector's arch loomed before him like a gateway between the world outside and the formal machinery of justice within. That's when Officer Bradley Ross looked up from his position behind the security desk. Bradley was 42 years old, with the kind of thick neck and aggressive posture that suggested he'd spent his career looking for reasons to flex the authority his badge provided. His uniform was crisp, his shoes polished, and his expression carried the perpetual scowl of a man who viewed every citizen as a potential threat to his personal sense of order. He'd been working courthouse security for 8 years, and in that time, he'd developed very specific ideas about who belonged in the halls of justice and who needed to be reminded of their place. When Bradley saw Luther Gray approaching the metal detector, his eyes narrowed with the kind of automatic suspicion he reserved for people who looked like Luther. He saw an elderly black man in a worn brown jacket, moving slowly, carrying himself with what Bradley interpreted as an attitude problem. He didn't see Luther's purple heart pin, small and unassuming on his lapel. He didn't see the careful way Luther organized his belongings, showing the respect for process that comes from a lifetime of understanding that rules matter. He didn't see the quiet dignity of a man who had earned his place in any room he chose to enter. What Bradley saw was an opportunity to establish dominance. "Move faster," Bradley barked as Luther approached the metal detector. "We don't have all day for you to figure out how this works." Luther looked up, surprised by the aggressive tone, but not particularly concerned. He'd dealt with difficult authority figures before. "I'm moving as quickly as I can, officer. My apologies if I'm holding things up." The polite response seemed to irritate Bradley further. There was something about Luther's calm dignity that rubbed against every assumption Bradley held about how these encounters were supposed to go. In Bradley's experience, elderly black men in worn jackets were supposed to shuffle and apologize and keep their eyes down. They weren't supposed to speak with the measured cadence of someone who expected to be treated with basic human respect. "Don't get smart with me," Bradley snapped, stepping out from behind the security desk. "Empty everything from your pockets, all of it, right now." Luther complied without complaint, placing his belongings in the plastic tray with the same methodical care he applied to everything. His wallet, worn leather that Margaret had given him for their 20th wedding anniversary, his keys, including the small American flag keychain his son Stephen had sent him from his first overseas deployment, the insulin kit that kept him alive, its medical alert sticker slightly faded but still clearly visible. Bradley examined each item with exaggerated suspicion, as if Luther's insulin pen might be some kind of weapon, as if the photograph of Margaret in Luther's wallet might contain hidden contraband. The other people in line began to shift uncomfortably, sensing that something was wrong with the way this routine security check was unfolding. "What's this?" Bradley demanded, holding up Luther's medication kit. "Insulin and glucose tablets." Luther replied evenly, "I'm diabetic. There should be a medical alert card in there explaining." "I'll decide what this is." Bradley cut him off. "You could be smuggling anything in here. Drugs, weapons, who knows what else." A woman behind Luther, in line, cleared her throat. "Officer, that's clearly marked medical equipment. I can see the prescription label from here." Bradley's head snapped toward the woman, a middle-aged attorney whose own security screening had taken all of 30 seconds. "Ma'am, I need you to step back and let me do my job. This man's security screening is a matter of courthouse safety." Luther felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came when his blood sugar started to fluctuate. The stress of the situation, combined with the morning's earlier medication timing, was beginning to affect his glucose levels. He needed to get through security and find somewhere to sit down, maybe check his levels, and take a glucose tablet if necessary. "Officer Ross," Luther said, reading the nameplate on Bradley's uniform. "I've been through courthouse security many times as a witness and for jury duty. I understand your procedures, and I'm happy to comply with whatever additional screening you feel is necessary. I just need to retrieve my medication once we're finished." It was exactly the wrong thing to say. The mention of Luther's familiarity with courthouse procedures, his assumption that he had any kind of established relationship with the building or its systems, struck Bradley as the height of arrogance. Who was this old man to suggest he knew anything about courthouse operations? Who was he to speak as if he had some kind of standing in this place? "You think you know how this works?" Bradley's voice rose loud enough that conversations across the lobby began to quiet. "You think you can just walk in here and tell me my job?" "I'm not telling you anything, officer. You're simply going to shut your mouth and follow my instructions," Bradley snarled, stepping closer to Luther. "You people think you can just walk in here like you own the place, don't you?" The phrase hung in the air like a physical presence. You people. Everyone in the lobby knew exactly what those words meant, understood the poison they carried, recognized the intent behind their delivery. A few people pulled out their phones, though whether to record the incident or simply to have something to do with their hands while witnessing this public humiliation was unclear. Luther's face remained composed, but something shifted behind his eyes. He'd heard those words before, in different contexts, from different people, across decades of navigating a world that often seemed determined to reduce him to a stereotype. He'd heard them from drill sergeants who thought a young black Marine couldn't cut it in the Corps. He'd heard them from supervisors at the factory job he'd worked for 30 years to support his family. He'd heard them from store clerks and bank tellers and school administrators and police officers who looked at his skin color and saw everything they thought they needed to know about who he was and what he deserved. But Luther had also learned something over the years that Officer Bradley Ross was about to discover. Dignity isn't something someone can take from you. It's something you either carry or you don't, and no amount of aggression or humiliation can strip it away from someone who truly possesses it. "Officer Ross," Luther said quietly, his voice carrying across the now silent lobby, "I'm here as a character witness for a young man who made some mistakes, but who deserves to have someone speak for his better nature. I'm not here to cause any trouble, and I'm certainly not here to disrespect this courthouse or your authority. I'm simply a citizen trying to participate in our justice system." The reasonableness of Luther's response seemed to enrage Bradley even further. He grabbed Luther by the arm, his fingers digging into the brown jacket's worn fabric. "Don't you lecture me about respect," Bradley hissed, his face close enough to Luther's that spit flew with his words. "I'll show you what respect looks like." That's when Bradley shoved Luther hard against the courthouse wall. The impact drove the air from Luther's lungs and sent a sharp pain through his shoulder where it struck the marble surface. His Purple Heart pin, jarred loose by the violence, clattered to the floor with a small metallic sound that seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly quiet lobby. Luther steadied himself against the wall, his hands flat against the cold marble, his breathing careful and controlled. He didn't fight back, didn't raise his voice, didn't give Bradley any excuse to escalate the violence further, but he also didn't cower. He straightened his jacket, located his Purple Heart pin where it had fallen, and pinned it back to his lapel with hands that shook only slightly. "Are we finished with the security screening, Officer Ross?" Luther asked, his voice steady despite the pain radiating through his shoulder and the dangerous way his blood sugar was now fluctuating in response to the stress and physical trauma. Bradley stared at him, breathing hard, his hands clenched into fists. He'd expected Luther to collapse, to submit, to give him the satisfying display of dominance he'd been seeking. Instead, he was looking at an elderly man who had absorbed his violence and remained standing, who had been publicly humiliated and somehow retained his dignity, who had been assaulted and was still asking politely about courthouse procedures. It was infuriating. "Yeah," Bradley finally muttered, stepping back but keeping his aggressive posture. "We're finished, for now." Luther collected his belongings from the security tray, checked his insulin kit to make sure nothing had been damaged, and walked through the metal detector with the same measured pace he'd maintained throughout the encounter. Several people in the lobby nodded at him as he passed, small gestures of respect and solidarity that acknowledged what they'd all witnessed. But Luther barely noticed them. His focus was on reaching the bench outside courtroom 3, where he could sit down and quietly take a glucose tablet before his blood sugar dropped any further. He had a job to do today. A young man who was counting on him to speak truth about character and second chances and the possibility of redemption. Officer Bradley Ross's abuse wasn't going to prevent him from fulfilling that responsibility. Luther made it to the bench and sat down carefully, feeling the ache in his shoulder where he'd struck the wall. He opened his insulin kit, checked his glucose meter, and confirmed what he'd already suspected. His blood sugar was dropping fast. Stress and physical trauma combining with his morning medication timing to create a potentially dangerous situation. As he placed a glucose tablet under his tongue and waited for his levels to stabilize, Luther thought about his son Stephen. 20 years in the military, the last 15 with special operations units that Luther wasn't supposed to know the details about. Stephen called every Sunday, visited when his deployment schedule allowed, and had inherited both his father's sense of justice and his mother's fierce protection of family. Luther had never told Stephen about the smaller indignities he faced, the casual disrespect and petty authority abuse that seemed to be part of navigating the world as an aging black man in the South. There was no point in worrying his son with problems Luther had learned to handle on his own. But as Luther sat on that courthouse bench, tasting glucose and feeling the pain in his shoulder, he realized that today might be different. Today, Officer Bradley Ross had crossed a line that Luther couldn't simply absorb and move past. Today, something had happened that might require a different kind of response. Luther pulled out his phone and stared at Stephen's contact information for a long moment. Then he put the phone away. He had testimony to give first, a young man's future to speak for, a job to finish. Whatever came next could wait until he'd honored his commitment to Mrs. Carter and her grandson. But as Luther Gray walked toward courtroom 3, his Purple Heart pin catching the light from the courthouse's tall windows, he carried with him the certain knowledge that Officer Bradley Ross had just made the kind of mistake that changes everything. The kind of mistake that transforms a quiet Tuesday morning into something that will be remembered long after the bruises fade and the paperwork is filed away. The kind of mistake that brings a warrior home. Luther Gray sat in his worn leather recliner, the same chair where he'd watched Sunday football games with Stephen throughout his son's childhood, where he'd read bedtime stories to his granddaughter Melody, where he'd spent countless quiet evenings missing Margaret's voice calling from the kitchen. The ice pack pressed against his shoulder had long since melted, leaving only a damp towel and the persistent ache that reminded him of Officer Bradley Ross's hands shoving him against that courthouse wall. The testimony had gone well. Despite everything, Luther had spoken clearly about Malik Carter's character, about the young man's willingness to help elderly neighbors, about his quiet struggle to support his younger siblings after his mother's death. The judge had listened, the jury had seemed engaged, and Luther had fulfilled his promise to Mrs. Carter. But now, in the familiar silence of his living room, the events at the security checkpoint felt heavier somehow, more significant than the simple harassment he'd initially dismissed them as. Luther's shoulder throbbed with each movement, and his blood sugar had required 2 additional glucose tablets during the afternoon to maintain stability. The stress of the morning's encounter had affected his diabetes more than he'd expected, a reminder that his 68-year-old body didn't bounce back from trauma the way it once had. He was reaching for his evening medication when he heard the front door open and close with the decisive sound that belonged to only one person in his life. "Grandpa Gray, I'm here," Melody's voice carried from the front hallway, bright and energetic in the way that only belonged to 22-year-olds who still believed the world made sense most of the time. She was home from her nursing program at Charleston Southern, where she was finishing her final semester before taking her state boards. "In the living room, sweetheart," Luther called back, quickly adjusting his position in the chair to hide the careful way he'd been holding his injured shoulder. Melody appeared in the doorway moments later, her scrubs still bearing the faint antiseptic smell of the hospital where she'd been doing her clinical rotations. She had inherited Margaret's bright smile and Luther's steady presence, creating a combination that made her equally comfortable, comforting scared patients and challenging professors who underestimated her capabilities. "How did the testimony go today?" she asked, dropping her nursing school bag by the door and moving to give Luther his customary hello hug. Luther started to rise from his chair to meet her embrace, but the sharp pain in his shoulder made him wince involuntarily. The small sound of discomfort was barely audible, but Melody had been training to notice exactly those kinds of details. "Grandpa." Her tone shifted immediately from casual affection to clinical concern. "What's wrong with your shoulder?" "Nothing, sweetheart. Just slept wrong last night, I think." Luther attempted to brush off her concern with the kind of gentle deflection he'd perfected over decades of not wanting to worry his family with his problems. But Melody had spent the last 2 years learning to read pain in faces that tried to hide it, to spot the subtle signs that patients use to minimize their discomfort. She knelt beside Luther's chair, her eyes scanning his posture with the systematic attention of someone trained to see what people tried to conceal. "Grandpa Gray, you didn't sleep wrong. Your shoulder is held completely differently than usual. You're favoring your left side, and your breathing is shallow, like you're protecting against pain. What happened today?" Luther looked into his granddaughter's face and saw Margaret's determination combined with Stephen's unwillingness to accept easy answers. Melody had inherited the family trait of seeing through attempts to minimize important truths. "There was a small incident at the courthouse during security screening," Luther said carefully. "Nothing serious, just a misunderstanding with one of the officers." "A misunderstanding that injured your shoulder." Melody's voice carried the edge that appeared whenever she suspected someone was trying to protect her from reality. "Grandpa, I need you to tell me exactly what happened." Luther sighed, recognizing the futility of trying to deflect his granddaughter when she'd locked onto a concern. "The security officer was having a difficult day, I think. He was more aggressive than necessary during the screening process, and I ended up against the wall harder than either of us intended." "He pushed you into a wall?" Melody's voice rose sharply. "An officer assaulted you during a security screening?" "Melody, sweetheart, it's not that simple. These things happen sometimes, and—" "No, Grandpa, they don't just happen." Melody stood up, her nursing training warring with her family loyalty to create a combination of clinical anger and personal outrage. "Officers don't accidentally push elderly citizens into walls during routine security checks. This was assault, and you need to report it." Luther watched his granddaughter pace across the living room, her scrubs rustling with the sharp movements of someone working through anger and disbelief. He could see Margaret in the set of her shoulders, the way she held her head when she was preparing to fight for something that mattered. But he could also see Stephen in the way she was already thinking strategically, already moving past the emotional reaction toward practical solutions. "I'm calling Dad," Melody announced, pulling out her phone. "Melody, wait." Luther's voice carried the authority that had once commanded Marine recruits and factory workers alike. "Your father has enough to worry about with his deployment schedule. There's no need to burden him with something I can handle myself." "Handle yourself?" Melody turned to face him, her phone still in her hand. "Grandpa, you're sitting in your living room with a shoulder injury from a police officer who assaulted you for no reason. This isn't something you handle yourself. This is something we handle as a family. Your father is serving his country in dangerous places, sweetheart. The last thing he needs is to worry about problems at home that he can't do anything about." Melody studied her grandfather's face for a long moment, reading the complex mixture of pride, pain, and protective love that had shaped every decision he'd made as a father and grandfather. She understood his desire to shield Stephen from civilian concerns while her father was focused on military operations, but she also understood something that Luther's generation sometimes struggled with, that family protection worked both ways, and that Stephen would be far more angry about being kept in the dark than he would be about being told the truth. "Grandpa Gray," Melody said gently, sitting back down beside his chair. "Dad didn't join the military to protect strangers while his family gets hurt at home. He joined to protect all of us, including you, and right now, you need protecting." Luther felt the weight of her words settling into the space between his desire to maintain his independence and his recognition that today's events had crossed a line he wasn't equipped to address alone. Officer Bradley Ross hadn't just been rude or dismissive, he'd been violent, aggressive in a way that suggested a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. "What would I even tell him?" Luther asked quietly. "That I got roughed up by courthouse security? That I let some officer with an attitude problem get under my skin?" "You'd tell him the truth," Melody replied firmly, "that you were assaulted by a police officer while trying to serve as a character witness, and that the officer used language and behavior that was clearly motivated by racism and authority abuse. You'd tell him that his father was attacked and that his father needs his help." Luther closed his eyes and thought about Stephen as a child, the serious little boy who'd inherited Luther's sense of justice and Margaret's fierce loyalty. Stephen had always been protective of his family, even as a young child. Luther remembered the day 8-year-old Stephen had confronted a neighborhood bully who'd been picking on smaller kids, the way his son had stood his ground despite being outnumbered and outweighed. That protective instinct had only intensified as Stephen grew older, driving him toward military service and eventually to the elite units where he'd spent his adult life learning to eliminate threats to American citizens. How would Stephen react to learning that his father had been one of those citizens under threat and that Luther had tried to handle it alone? "He's going to be angry," Luther said finally. "Yes, he is," Melody agreed. "He's going to be angry at Officer Ross for assaulting his father. He's going to be angry at the system that allowed it to happen. And he's probably going to be a little angry at you for trying to keep it from him. But he's not going to be angry at you for calling." Luther nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in his granddaughter's words. Stephen had always been direct about wanting to know when his family faced problems, even when he was stationed halfway around the world. The last thing Luther wanted was for his son to find out about today's events through some other channel, to feel like his father didn't trust him enough to share important information. "Make the call, sweetheart," Luther said quietly. Melody squeezed his uninjured hand and scrolled through her contacts to find Stephen's number. She knew her father's schedule well enough to know that evening calls usually reached him during a window when he could speak freely, though she never knew exactly where in the world he might be taking those calls. The phone rang 3 times before Stephen's familiar voice answered. "Hey baby girl, how's nursing school treating you?" "Hi Dad, school's fine, but I'm calling about Grandpa Gray." Melody's voice carried the serious tone that Stephen would recognize immediately as a signal that this wasn't a routine family check-in. Luther heard his son's voice shift into what Melody had learned to recognize as Stephen's professional mode, the calm, focused attention that he brought to situations that required assessment and potential action. What's wrong? Is he hurt? He's sitting right here with me, and he's okay overall, but something happened today that he needs to tell you about. Melody looked at Luther encouragingly. I'm going to put him on. Luther took the phone with his good hand, feeling the familiar comfort of hearing his son's voice combined with the unfamiliar difficulty of having to share a problem he couldn't solve independently. Stephen, son, how are you doing? I'm fine, Dad. Melody says something happened today. Talk to me. Luther could hear the military precision in Stephen's voice, the way his son had learned to cut through social pleasantries when information was needed quickly. It was a tone Luther recognized from his own Marine Corps days, the voice of someone trained to assess threats and respond appropriately. I was at the courthouse today, testifying as a character witness for Mrs. Carter's grandson, Luther began, deciding to start with the context rather than the incident itself. Okay, Stephen said, and Luther could hear him settling in to listen to the full story. During the security screening, I had an encounter with one of the officers, Officer Bradley Ross. He became aggressive during what should have been a routine procedure, and things escalated beyond what they should have. Define aggressive, Dad. Luther recognized that Stephen was asking for tactical details, the specific information needed to understand the scope and nature of the threat. It was the same voice Stephen had used as a teenager when other kids had given Luther problems. The careful questioning that helped Stephen decide what kind of response was appropriate. He used language suggesting that people like me didn't belong in the courthouse. He became physical during the security screening, ultimately shoving me against the wall hard enough to injure my shoulder and knock my Purple Heart pin to the floor. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Luther wondered if the connection had been lost. When Stephen finally spoke, his voice carried a controlled intensity that Luther hadn't heard since his son was a young Marine, learning to channel anger into effective action. Are you seriously injured? No, son. Sore shoulder, some blood sugar issues from the stress, but nothing that won't heal. Did anyone witness the incident? The entire security lobby saw it happen. Several people recorded it on their phones. Did you file a report? Luther hesitated, knowing that his answer would disappoint his son. I completed my testimony first. I felt it was important to honor my commitment to Mrs. Carter and her grandson. Dad, Stephen's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining something fundamental. Honoring your commitments is important, but allowing someone to assault you without consequences isn't honor. It's enabling them to assault the next person who looks like you. Luther felt the truth of his son's words settling into the space where his own confusion about how to respond had been living. He'd been so focused on not letting Officer Ross's behavior derail his testimony that he hadn't considered the broader implications of letting the assault go unreported. What do you think I should do, son? I think you should file a formal complaint tomorrow morning, and I think you should document your injuries with photographs and medical records if necessary. I also think you should be prepared for the possibility that the initial complaint might not receive the attention it deserves. And if it doesn't, then you let me know, and we explore other options. Luther could hear something in Stephen's voice that suggested his son was already thinking several steps ahead, already considering what those other options might involve. It was both comforting and slightly concerning to know that Stephen was bringing his professional problem-solving skills to bear on a family situation. Stephen, I don't want you to do anything that might compromise your career or your mission responsibilities. Dad, my mission is protecting American citizens from people who want to hurt them. That mission doesn't pause when one of those citizens is my father. The simple clarity of Stephen's statement cut through all of Luther's concerns about being a burden or creating problems his son couldn't handle. Stephen wasn't seeing this as a distraction from his real responsibilities. He was seeing it as an extension of them. I'll file the complaint tomorrow, Luther said. Good. And Dad, next time something like this happens, you call me immediately. Don't wait until Melody has to force the conversation. Understood, son. I love you, Dad, and I'm proud of you for testifying today. Even after what that officer put you through, that took courage. I love you too, Stephen. Luther handed the phone back to Melody, who spoke quietly with her father for a few more minutes before ending the call. When she hung up, she looked at her grandfather with a mixture of relief and determination. "Feel better?" she asked. "I do," Luther admitted. "Your father has a way of making problems seem more manageable. He also has a way of making problems disappear when they threaten people he cares about," Melody said with a small smile. "Officer Bradley Ross has no idea what he just brought down on himself." Luther settled back in his chair, feeling the tension he'd been carrying since morning finally beginning to ease. His shoulders still hurt, and he'd still need to navigate the complaint process tomorrow, but he no longer felt like he was facing those challenges alone. Outside, the Charleston evening was settling into the comfortable rhythm of a city preparing for rest. But in a secure facility several time zones away, Navy SEAL Commander Stephen Gray was beginning to research Officer Bradley Ross using skills and resources that would have made the courthouse security officer reconsider every decision he'd made that morning. The phone call was over, but the real conversation was just beginning. Stephen Gray's boots hit Charleston soil at 0347 hours on a Thursday morning, exactly 36 hours after receiving Melody's phone call. He'd used military transport channels and emergency leave authorization that his commanding officer had approved without question, a benefit of 15 years of flawless service and 0 personal requests for early return from deployment. The overnight flight had given Stephen time to think, to plan, and to make preliminary inquiries through channels that Officer Bradley Ross would never imagine existed. By the time Stephen reached his rental car in the airport parking lot, he already knew more about Bradley Ross than the officer knew about himself. The file Stephen had assembled during his travel time painted a picture of a man who'd spent 8 years using his badge to intimidate people he perceived as vulnerable. 3 internal complaints that had been quietly dismissed. 2 excessive force allegations that had somehow disappeared from his record. And most importantly, a pattern of targeting elderly black citizens during routine interactions, behavior that suggested systematic rather than random abuse. Stephen drove through Charleston's quiet morning streets with the methodical precision he brought to all reconnaissance missions. The city looked peaceful in the pre-dawn darkness, its antebellum architecture and carefully maintained historic districts creating an atmosphere of Southern gentility that masked the more complicated realities of life for people who looked like his father. Luther's house sat on Maple Street in a neighborhood that had been solidly middle class when Stephen was growing up, where factory workers and veterans had built modest lives through steady employment and careful savings. The houses were smaller now than Stephen remembered from childhood, but Luther's yard was still perfectly maintained, his front porch still swept clean, and his American flag still hung at exactly the proper angle and height. Stephen parked across the street and studied his father's house through the tactical lens he'd developed over years of assessing environments for potential threats. Luther would be awake soon. The old Marine had maintained military schedule habits throughout his civilian life, and Stephen wanted to observe the neighborhood dynamics before announcing his presence. What he saw confirmed some of his preliminary research and raised new concerns. The house 2 doors down from Luther's showed signs of recent police attention. Tire tracks in the front yard, a broken porch light that looked like it had been damaged during some kind of altercation, and the subtle signs of a residence that had been searched roughly. Stephen made a mental note to investigate whether that incident involved Officer Ross or his colleagues. At 0600 hours, Stephen knocked on his father's front door, using the family pattern. 2 short, 1 long, 2 short that he'd established as a child to distinguish his arrival from strangers or unwelcome visitors. Luther opened the door wearing his bathrobe and a surprised expression that quickly shifted to concern when he saw his son standing on the porch in civilian clothes with a duffel bag and the focused intensity that Stephen brought home from particularly serious missions. "Son, what are you doing here?" "Emergency leave, Dad. We need to talk." Luther stepped aside to let Stephen enter, noting the way his son automatically scanned the living room for sightlines and potential security concerns, habits that never entirely disappeared, even in the safest civilian environments. "Coffee's already made," Luther said, leading Stephen toward the kitchen. "But you didn't need to come home for this, Stephen. I told you I was going to file the complaint today." "I know what you told me, Dad. I also know that filing a complaint against Officer Bradley Ross through normal channels is likely to result in exactly the same outcome as the last 3 complaints filed against him. Nowhere." Stephen accepted the coffee his father offered and sat at the kitchen table where he'd eaten countless childhood breakfasts, where Luther had helped him with homework, where the family had gathered for holiday meals back when Margaret was alive to orchestrate those celebrations. "You've already investigated him," Luther said. It wasn't a question. "Preliminary research. Yes, Bradley Ross has been using his position to abuse elderly black citizens for years. Dad, what happened to you wasn't an isolated incident or a bad day. It was his standard operating procedure." Luther sat across from his son, recognizing the controlled intensity that Stephen displayed when he'd identified a target that needed to be eliminated. It was both reassuring and slightly unsettling to see that focus directed toward a civilian problem. "What did you find?" Stephen pulled out a tablet and opened a file that contained more information about Officer Bradley Ross than existed in any official database. The advantages of military intelligence training, combined with special operations resources, had allowed Stephen to compile a comprehensive profile during his travel time. Ross has been working courthouse security for 8 years. During that time, he's had 14 documented interactions with elderly black citizens that resulted in complaints, injuries, or public incidents. The official record shows 3 complaints, all dismissed. The actual number is much higher. How do you know about interactions that weren't officially reported? Hospital emergency room visits following courthouse security incidents. Pharmacy records showing increased anxiety, medication prescriptions after courthouse appearances. Social media posts by family members describing incidents that match Ross's behavior pattern. People talk about these things, Dad, even when they don't file formal complaints. Luther studied the information his son had compiled, recognizing the thoroughness that had made Stephen successful in military operations that required complete understanding of enemy capabilities and behavior patterns. "There's more," Stephen continued. "Ross has been claiming veteran status on his employment applications and in social media profiles. He lists military service that never happened, uses that false background to justify preferential treatment during hiring, and leverages fake veteran credentials to deflect criticism of his behavior. Stolen valor? Federal crime, Dad. And one that particularly pisses off people like me who actually earned the credentials he's pretending to have." Luther could hear the edge in Stephen's voice that appeared when his son encountered people who claimed honor they hadn't earned. Military service was sacred in the Gray family, something that connected Luther's Marine Corps experience to Stephen's Navy career and created a bond of shared sacrifice and commitment. Someone falsely claiming that heritage had violated something fundamental. "What's your plan, son?" "First, we document your injuries and file the formal complaint through proper channels. We give the system a chance to work the way it's supposed to. But we also prepare for the likelihood that the official channels will protect Ross the same way they've protected him for the past 8 years. And if the official channels fail?" Stephen's expression shifted into what Melody had learned to recognize as her father's problem-solving mode. The calm calculation that appeared when he was working through complex tactical challenges. "Then we use other resources to ensure that Ross faces consequences for his behavior and that the pattern of abuse stops permanently." Luther heard something in his son's voice that suggested Stephen was already several steps ahead in his planning, already considering options that went beyond civilian complaint procedures. It was both comforting and concerning to know that Stephen was bringing his professional capabilities to bear on a personal problem. "Stephen, I need you to promise me that whatever you do, it won't compromise your military career or put you at legal risk." "Dad, everything I'm planning is completely legal and appropriate. I'm not going to do anything that violates my oath or my obligations. But I am going to use every resource available to me to protect my father and prevent Ross from hurting anyone else." The simple clarity of Stephen's statement reassured Luther while also making it clear that Officer Bradley Ross had created a problem much larger than he could possibly understand. Stephen wasn't just responding as an angry son. He was responding as a professional who'd spent his career learning to eliminate threats to innocent people. Where do we start? Medical documentation first. I want photographs of your injuries, a formal medical examination if necessary, and a complete record of how Ross's assault affected your diabetes management. Then we go to the courthouse and file the formal complaint. But we do it with the kind of documentation that makes dismissal much more difficult. And then I start talking to the other people Ross has victimized, and I begin building a federal case that doesn't depend on local authorities who might be inclined to protect him. Stephen spent the next 2 hours systematically documenting Luther's injuries with photographs that captured not just the visible bruising on his shoulder, but the more subtle signs of trauma that medical professionals would recognize. He recorded Luther's account of the incident with the precision of someone trained to gather intelligence that might be used in legal proceedings. At 0900 hours, they drove to Charleston County Courthouse together. Stephen had insisted on accompanying Luther to file the complaint, not just for moral support, but to observe the courthouse security procedures and get a first-hand look at the environment where Ross operated. He wanted to understand the physical layout, the staffing patterns, and the institutional culture that had allowed Ross's behavior to continue unchecked. The courthouse lobby looked different to Stephen than it would to most visitors. Where civilians saw marble floors and formal architectural details, Stephen saw sightlines and choke points and security vulnerabilities. Where others noticed the flow of lawyers and court staff, Stephen observed the dynamics between security personnel and citizens, looking for patterns that might explain how Ross had been able to abuse his authority for so long. Officer Bradley Ross was not working the security checkpoint that morning. The officer who was on duty, a younger man named Patterson, according to his nameplate, processed Luther through security screening with professional courtesy and efficiency. No aggressive questioning, no unnecessary delays, no hostile language or intimidating behavior. It was exactly the kind of routine, respectful interaction that courthouse security should involve. Stephen made note of the contrast. The complaint filing process took place in the courthouse administration office, where a clerk accepted Luther's formal statement and supporting documentation with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that suggested such complaints were routine rather than exceptional. She provided a case number, explained the investigation timeline, and assured Luther that the matter would be reviewed by Internal Affairs within 10 business days. Stephen watched the entire process with the systematic attention he brought to all information-gathering operations. He noted which forms were used, which departments would be involved in the review process, and which officials would have access to the complaint file. He also noted the clerk's body language and verbal responses, looking for signs of whether Luther's complaint would receive genuine attention or routine dismissal. What he observed wasn't encouraging. The clerk's demeanor suggested that complaints against Officer Ross were familiar rather than surprising. Her explanations of the investigation process carried the tone of someone who delivered the same information many times before, and her timeline estimates seemed designed to discourage follow-up rather than provide realistic expectations for resolution. After completing the formal complaint process, Stephen and Luther walked back through the courthouse lobby toward the exit. Stephen used the opportunity to observe the security checkpoint operations more carefully, noting camera positions, staffing rotations, and the general atmosphere that courthouse employees maintained. That's when he saw Officer Bradley Ross. Ross was emerging from a side corridor that led to the courthouse break rooms, wearing his uniform and carrying himself with the aggressive confidence that Stephen recognized from Luther's description. Ross was laughing with 2 other officers about something that had evidently amused them greatly, his voice loud enough to be heard across the lobby. Stephen studied Officer Ross with the systematic attention he'd learned to apply to enemy combatants, noting physical capabilities, behavioral patterns, and psychological indicators that might be relevant to future interactions. What he saw was a man who carried himself like someone accustomed to intimidating people without consequences, who moved through the courthouse like he owned it rather than worked in it. Ross hadn't noticed Luther and Stephen yet, but Stephen made a deliberate decision to change that. "Dad," Stephen said quietly, I want you to walk past the security checkpoint, and I want Ross to see you. Stephen, I don't want to create another incident. You won't. But I want to observe his reaction to seeing you again, and I want him to notice that you're not alone today." Luther understood what his son was asking, and he trusted Stephen's tactical judgment, even when he didn't entirely understand the strategy. They walked past the security checkpoint at a normal pace, Luther maintaining the dignified posture that had carried him through decades of navigating difficult situations. Officer Bradley Ross looked up and immediately recognized Luther from their previous encounter. His expression shifted from casual amusement to something darker, a combination of annoyance and aggressive interest that suggested he was considering whether to create another confrontation. That's when Ross noticed Stephen. Stephen Gray, in civilian clothes, still carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of elite military training. His posture, his awareness of his surroundings, and his focused attention created an immediate impression of someone who was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with aggression or intimidation. Ross looked at Stephen and recognized, without understanding exactly what he was seeing, that he was in the presence of someone who operated on a completely different level than courthouse security officers. Stephen met Ross's gaze directly, holding eye contact, just long enough to communicate that he was paying attention, that he was assessing, and that he was not intimidated. It wasn't a threat. Nothing in Stephen's demeanor violated any legal or professional standards, but it was a clear message that Officer Bradley Ross was now being watched by someone with the skills and resources to watch very effectively. Ross looked away first. Stephen and Luther continued walking toward the courthouse exit without incident. But Stephen had learned what he needed to know. Officer Bradley Ross was accustomed to intimidating people who couldn't fight back, but he became much less confident when faced with someone who might represent a different kind of challenge. As they reached Stephen's rental car, Luther spoke quietly. "He recognized that you're military. He recognized that I'm not someone he can push around the way he pushed you around. That's going to make him more careful, but it's also going to make him more dangerous to other people who look like easier targets. Meaning we need to move quickly to ensure that Ross faces consequences before he escalates his behavior or takes his frustrations out on someone else." Stephen started the car and pulled out of the courthouse parking lot, already planning the next phase of his investigation. The formal complaint had been filed, giving the system a chance to work properly. But Stephen had seen enough to know that the system would likely fail, just as it had failed Ross's previous victims. When that happened, Stephen would be ready with alternatives that Officer Bradley Ross had never imagined possible. The investigation was just beginning. The Charleston County Sheriff's Department Internal Affairs Office occupied a windowless room on the third floor of the administrative building, deliberately isolated from the public areas where citizens might observe the machinery of police accountability in action. Detective Captain Pierce Coleman had run internal investigations for 12 years, long enough to develop very specific ideas about which complaints deserved serious attention and which could be managed through administrative efficiency. Luther Gray's complaint landed on Coleman's desk at 13:47 hours on Friday afternoon, exactly 3 business days after the incident and 2 days after Stephen Gray had filed the formal paperwork. Coleman read through the documentation with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to spot potential problems before they became actual problems. What he saw concerned him, but not for the reasons Luther and Stephen might have hoped. The complaint was too well documented, too precise, too professionally prepared for a routine citizen grievance against courthouse security. Luther's statement read like it had been written by someone with law enforcement or military training, someone who understood exactly which details would be legally significant and which language would be most difficult to dismiss through standard procedures. Coleman reached for his phone and dialed the direct line to Sergeant Maxwell Turner, Officer Bradley Ross's immediate supervisor, and the man responsible for courthouse security personnel. "Turner, we need to talk about your boy Ross. Now." 20 minutes later, Sergeant Turner sat across from Coleman's desk with the uncomfortable expression of a man who'd been expecting this conversation for months, but hoping it would never actually happen. Turner was a 20-year veteran who'd learned to navigate department politics by avoiding problems rather than solving them, and Officer Bradley Ross had always represented the kind of problem that required more energy than Turner wanted to invest. "How bad is it?" Turner asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Bad enough," Coleman replied, sliding Luther's complaint across the desk. "Read it and tell me how we're going to make this go away." Turner scanned the document with growing unease. Luther's statement was methodical and detailed, supported by medical documentation, witness contact information, and a timeline that would be difficult to contradict. Worse, the complaint had been filed by someone who clearly understood legal procedures and administrative requirements. Ross says the old man got aggressive during security screening, became combative when asked to comply with standard procedures. Turner offered weakly. "Ross says a lot of things, Max. The problem is that this complaint doesn't read like it came from someone who got aggressive during security screening. It reads like it came from someone who knows exactly how these investigations work and exactly how to document an incident to make dismissal impossible." Coleman leaned back in his chair and studied Turner with the calculating expression he used when department interests required difficult decisions. "Tell me about the complainant, Luther Gray. What do we know about him?" Turner pulled out his phone and scrolled through the preliminary background check he'd requested after receiving Coleman's call. 68 years old, Marine Corps veteran, lives alone on Maple Street. Retired factory worker, no criminal record, no history of complaints against law enforcement. Family, one son, Stephen Gray. That's where it gets interesting. Coleman's attention sharpened. How interesting. Navy SEAL, currently deployed with special operations, multiple commendations, security clearance that our system can't even access. The kind of military record that opens doors and creates problems for people who get on his bad side. The information settled into Coleman's consciousness like a cold weight in his stomach. A complaint from a random elderly citizen could be managed through standard procedures, delayed, minimized, eventually dismissed through administrative attrition. But a complaint from the father of an elite military operator with federal connections and specialized training created entirely different challenges. How much does the son know about the incident? Unknown. But given that this complaint was filed with military precision and professional documentation, I'd assume he knows everything and he's involved in whatever response is being planned. Coleman stared at Luther's complaint for a long moment, recognizing that he was facing exactly the kind of situation he'd spent 12 years learning to avoid. Officer Bradley Ross had finally picked the wrong target, someone connected to resources and capabilities that could make the department's usual protective strategies completely ineffective. What's Ross's story about what happened? Turner shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He maintains that Luther Gray became belligerent during routine security screening, used profanity and racial language against Ross, and had to be physically restrained to prevent him from creating a security incident. And you believe that? I believe that Ross has had similar incidents with elderly black citizens before, and that he has a pattern of escalating routine interactions into confrontations that somehow always result in civilians getting hurt. Coleman appreciated Turner's honesty, even though it created additional complications for managing the current situation. A supervisor who admitted knowing about an officer's pattern of abuse couldn't later claim ignorance if that pattern became the subject of federal investigation. How many similar incidents are we talking about? Officially, the 3 previous complaints that were dismissed through administrative review. Unofficially, I've heard about at least 6 or 7 other incidents over the past 2 years where Ross's behavior created problems that people chose not to report. Why didn't you address the pattern earlier? Turner's silence answered the question more clearly than words could have. He'd known about Ross's behavior, had recognized the pattern, but had chosen administrative convenience over intervention. Now that choice was creating exactly the kind of exposure he'd been trying to avoid. "What do you recommend?" Coleman asked. "Honestly, I think we need to cut Ross loose before this gets worse. The Gray family isn't going to be satisfied with a standard administrative review, and Ross doesn't have the political protection or professional competence to survive the kind of scrutiny they're likely to bring." Coleman considered Turner's recommendation while calculating the broader implications for department operations. Officer Bradley Ross was expendable, a courthouse security officer with a pattern of civilian complaints and no significant allies within the department hierarchy. But the precedent of actually holding an officer accountable for abusing elderly black citizens could create expectations that might be difficult to manage in future cases. "There's another problem," Coleman said finally. "If we discipline Ross for this incident, it establishes that his behavior was inappropriate. That creates liability exposure for all the previous incidents that we dismissed without proper investigation." Turner understood immediately. Acknowledging that Ross had violated Luther Gray's rights would implicitly acknowledge that he'd probably violated other citizens' rights during incidents that the department had previously minimized or ignored. The civil liability implications could be enormous. So what's the alternative? We follow standard procedure: administrative review, witness interviews, documentation analysis. We take our time. We do everything by the book. And we hope that the Gray family gets tired of waiting for resolution. And if they don't get tired of waiting? Coleman's expression suggested that he was already considering that possibility and developing contingency plans. Then we deal with that problem when it becomes a problem. Right now, our priority is containing the current situation and preventing it from expanding into something we can't control. While Coleman and Turner strategized about damage control, Officer Bradley Ross was having lunch at Murphy's Tavern, a bar 3 blocks from the courthouse that served as an unofficial gathering place for law enforcement personnel who wanted to discuss work matters away from official scrutiny. Ross sat at his usual table with officers Danny Mitchell and Kevin Harper, 2 courthouse security colleagues who shared his views about citizens who needed to be reminded of their place in the social hierarchy. The conversation had naturally turned to Luther Gray's complaint and the complications it might create for Ross's continued employment. "Administrative review is just theater," Ross said confidently, cutting into his burger with the aggressive precision he brought to most activities. "Coleman knows how these things work. The old man will get tired of fighting the bureaucracy, and the whole thing will disappear into the filing system." "You sure about that?" Mitchell asked. "Word is that the complainant has family connections that might make this different from your usual citizen complaints." "What kind of connections?" "Military connections. High-level military connections." Ross paused mid-bite, recognizing for the first time that Luther Gray might not be the isolated elderly citizen he'd assumed. The memory of the younger man who'd accompanied Luther to the courthouse flashed through his mind, someone who'd carried himself with unmistakable military bearing and had looked at Ross with the kind of assessment that suggested professional rather than personal interest. How high level are we talking? Special operations, high level. The kind of military background that comes with federal security clearances and friends in places that can create problems for local law enforcement. The information settled into Ross's consciousness with uncomfortable implications. He'd spent 8 years building his reputation as someone who could intimidate citizens without consequences, relying on the assumption that his targets would be isolated individuals with no resources for fighting back effectively. The possibility that Luther Gray's family included someone with elite military training and federal connections changed the risk calculation significantly. "What do you think I should do?" Harper leaned forward conspiratorially. "I think you should start working on your story about how the incident happened, and I think you should make sure that story can't be contradicted by any evidence that might surface later." "What kind of evidence?" "Security camera footage, witness statements, medical records. Anything that could make your version of events look inconsistent with the physical evidence." Ross considered his colleague's advice while reviewing his memory of the incident with Luther Gray. He'd been aggressive, certainly, but he'd also been careful to ensure that his behavior could be justified as necessary security measures if questioned later. He'd pushed Luther against the wall, but he could claim that Luther had been resisting screening procedures and that physical restraint had been required for courthouse safety. "The old man never fought back," Ross said thoughtfully, "never raised his voice, never made any aggressive moves, just stood there and took it like he was too scared to defend himself." "That's actually a problem," Mitchell pointed out. "If he never became aggressive or threatening, it's harder to justify using physical force against him." "Unless he was verbally abusive," Harper suggested. "Used racial language, made threats against security personnel. created a disturbance that required intervention. Ross understood what his colleagues were proposing. Luther Gray's dignified behavior during the incident had made it difficult to justify Ross's aggressive response. But Luther's character could be attacked retroactively through testimony that painted him as verbally abusive and threatening. It would be Ross's word against Luther's, and Ross had a badge and 8 years of courthouse security experience to support his credibility. "You think that would work?" "I think it's your best option," Harper replied. "Administrative investigations depend on officer testimony. If your testimony establishes that Luther Gray was verbally abusive and potentially threatening, that creates justification for whatever physical measures you had to take to maintain courthouse security." The strategy appealed to Ross's sense of how these situations should be resolved. He'd spent years getting away with aggressive behavior by relying on his badge and his colleagues' willingness to support whatever story protected department interests. A few modifications to his account of the Luther Gray incident could transform it from an assault on an elderly citizen into a justified response to a security threat. What about witnesses? Witnesses see what they expect to see, Mitchell said with practiced cynicism. Most people don't pay careful attention to security incidents, and their memories can be influenced by how the incident is described to them later. Ross nodded, feeling more confident about his ability to control the narrative around Luther Gray's complaint. Administrative investigations were designed to protect officers who made honest mistakes in difficult situations. With the right story and the right support from his colleagues, Ross could frame his behavior as appropriate professional conduct rather than criminal assault. What Ross didn't know was that Stephen Gray had spent the previous 2 days systematically interviewing every person who'd witnessed the incident at the courthouse security checkpoint. Stephen had collected contact information, recorded detailed statements, and obtained written testimonies that would be difficult for administrative investigators to dismiss or minimize. Stephen had also requested security camera footage through federal channels that bypassed local administrative control, using military intelligence protocols that courthouse officials had never encountered and didn't know how to resist. By the time Officer Bradley Ross finished his lunch and returned to work, confident that he could control the investigation through testimony and departmental loyalty, Stephen Gray had already assembled a case file that would make those strategies completely ineffective. The system protection that Ross was counting on was about to encounter resources he'd never imagined possible. Meanwhile, Luther Gray sat in his living room, reviewing the medical documentation that Stephen had insisted on obtaining. His shoulder injury was healing slowly, and his diabetes management had required careful adjustment following the stress of the courthouse incident. But what concerned Luther more than his physical recovery was the growing understanding that his encounter with Officer Ross represented something larger than personal harassment. Stephen had shared some of his research findings, enough for Luther to understand that Ross had been systematically abusing elderly black citizens for years, while the department's administrative structure protected him from consequences. Luther's complaint wasn't just about seeking justice for his own mistreatment. It was about stopping a pattern of abuse that had affected multiple families in their community. That afternoon, Luther received a phone call from Mrs. Evelyn Carter, his neighbor whose grandson's trial had brought Luther to the courthouse on the day he'd encountered Officer Ross. "Luther, I heard about what happened to you at the courthouse," Mrs. Carter said, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone discussing sensitive information. "I wanted you to know that you're not the only one." "What do you mean, Evelyn?" "I mean that Officer Ross has hurt other people from our neighborhood, people who were afraid to complain because they didn't think anyone would listen, or because they didn't want to cause trouble for their families." The information confirmed what Stephen had discovered through his own investigation, but hearing it from Mrs. Carter made it personal in a way that research data couldn't. These weren't statistics or case files. They were neighbors and community members who'd been victimized by someone who was supposed to protect courthouse security. How many people are we talking about? At least 4 that I know of personally. Maybe more who haven't talked about it openly. Luther felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. His decision to file a complaint against Officer Ross had implications beyond his own situation. If he successfully held Ross accountable, it might encourage other victims to come forward. If he failed, it might discourage future complaints and enable Ross to continue his pattern of abuse. "Evelyn, Would those people be willing to speak with my son? He's helping me with the complaint process, and he thinks it might be important to document the broader pattern of Ross's behavior. I can ask them. But Luther, you need to understand that some of these folks are scared. They don't want to get involved in anything that might bring more police attention to their families. Luther understood the fear that Mrs. Carter was describing. In their community, interactions with law enforcement carried risks that extended far beyond individual incidents. Families with young men worried about creating records that might be used against their children later. Elderly residents feared retaliation that might take forms they couldn't anticipate or protect against. Tell them that my son has resources to protect people who come forward, and that the goal is stopping Ross from hurting anyone else, Luther said. But also tell them that I understand if they're not comfortable getting involved. After ending the call with Mrs. Carter, Luther sat quietly in his living room, thinking about the complexity of the situation he and Stephen were navigating. Officer Bradley Ross wasn't just an individual problem. He was a symptom of institutional systems that enabled abuse and protected officers who violated citizens' rights. Fighting Ross effectively would require challenging those systems, and challenging those systems would require resources and capabilities that most citizens didn't possess. Luther felt grateful that Stephen brought elite military training and federal connections to the effort, but he also understood that they were attempting something that had defeated other families who'd faced similar situations. That evening, Stephen returned from another day of investigation, with news that both encouraged and concerned Luther. Dad, I've confirmed that Ross has been falsifying his military service record for years. Not just exaggerating, completely fabricating service that never happened. That's a federal crime, and it gives us jurisdiction options that bypass local administrative control. That's encouraging. It is. But I also learned that the department's Internal Affairs Office is already working on strategies to protect Ross from serious consequences. They're planning to claim that your complaint lacks sufficient evidence for disciplinary action. Luther felt a familiar frustration at the institutional resistance they were encountering. What kind of evidence would they consider sufficient? Stephen's expression shifted into the focused intensity that appeared when he was preparing to overcome obstacles that others considered insurmountable. The kind of evidence they won't be able to dismiss or minimize. The kind that makes protecting Ross more dangerous for them than holding him accountable. What does that mean? It means we're going to give them a choice between disciplining one problem officer or facing a federal investigation that exposes the entire system that's been protecting him. Luther heard something in his son's voice that suggested the investigation was about to move beyond complaint procedures and administrative reviews into territory that Officer Bradley Ross and his supervisors had never encountered before. The system protection was about to meet systematic destruction. The word spread through Charleston's Maple Street neighborhood, the way important news always traveled in close-knit communities, quietly, carefully, through conversations on front porches and whispered exchanges at the corner grocery store. Luther Gray had filed a complaint against Officer Bradley Ross, and somehow that act of courage was giving other people permission to speak about experiences they'd kept silent for years. Mrs. Evelyn Carter had made the first call, but by Tuesday morning, 3 more families had reached out to Luther through carefully established networks of trust and mutual protection. Each conversation followed the same pattern: a cautious introduction, a shared story of humiliation at courthouse security, and a tentative question about whether speaking up might actually accomplish something this time. Stephen Gray spent Monday and Tuesday conducting interviews in living rooms and kitchens throughout the neighborhood, using skills he'd developed for gathering intelligence from civilian populations in hostile territories. But instead of extracting information about enemy movements, he was documenting a pattern of domestic abuse that had been hidden in plain sight for years. The stories shared disturbing similarities. Clarence Foster, 71 years old, had been forced to remove his Purple Heart pin and Vietnam veteran hat during a security screening that lasted 45 minutes while Officer Ross verified that his military decorations were authentic. Clarence had stood in the courthouse lobby in his undershirt, while Ross made jokes about stolen valor and fake heroes, loud enough for everyone to hear. Dorothy Jenkins, 64 years old, had been subjected to an invasive pat-down search after Ross claimed her diabetes medication looked suspicious. She'd been forced to stand with her arms raised while Ross examined her insulin kit piece by piece, commenting loudly about drug dealers who used medical equipment to smuggle contraband into courthouses. Vernon Watson, 69 years old, had been shoved to the ground when he'd asked to speak with a supervisor after Ross confiscated his walking cane and claimed it could be used as a weapon. Vernon had spent 2 hours in the courthouse lobby without his mobility aid while Ross processed other visitors, returning the cane only after Vernon had missed his scheduled court appearance. Each story revealed the same pattern: elderly black citizens humiliated during routine courthouse visits, subjected to unnecessary delays and invasive procedures, treated with contempt and aggression that had no legitimate security justification. And each story ended the same way, with victims who chose not to file complaints because they assumed nothing would change and because they feared retaliation against themselves or their families. Stephen documented each account with meticulous attention to detail, recording dates, times, witnesses, and specific language used by Officer Ross during the incidents. He photographed injuries that hadn't healed properly, collected medical records showing treatment for stress-related complications, and gathered contact information for family members who could corroborate the impact of Ross's behavior. What emerged was a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond individual misconduct. Officer Bradley Ross had been using his position to terrorize elderly black citizens for years, creating an atmosphere of intimidation that discouraged courthouse access and undermined basic civil rights. By Wednesday evening, Stephen had compiled enough evidence to support federal civil rights charges against Ross and administrative misconduct charges against the supervisors who'd enabled his behavior. But he also understood that evidence alone wouldn't be sufficient to overcome the institutional resistance they were facing. The community needed to speak with one voice, and that voice needed to be loud enough to demand attention from authorities who'd learned to ignore individual complaints. Stephen proposed a community meeting. "Dad, I think it's time for everyone affected by Ross's behavior to come together and coordinate our response," Stephen said over dinner Wednesday night. "Individual complaints can be dismissed or minimized, but a coordinated community effort is much harder to ignore." Luther considered his son's suggestion while finishing the pot roast that Melody had prepared during her evening visit. The idea of a public meeting appealed to his sense of democratic participation and community organizing, but it also carried risks that concerned him. "People in this neighborhood are private, Stephen. They don't like drawing attention to themselves, especially when that attention might involve law enforcement or legal proceedings." "I understand that, Dad, but Rosa Parks was private too, and sometimes private people have to take public stands when the situation demands it." The comparison to Rosa Parks wasn't lost on Luther, who'd been a teenager in Montgomery when the bus boycott had transformed a single act of resistance into a community movement that changed history. He'd learned then that individual courage could inspire collective action, but only when people believed that their efforts might actually accomplish something meaningful. Where would we hold such a meeting? Somewhere familiar and comfortable. Somewhere that feels safe to people who've been victimized by someone in a uniform. Luther thought for a moment, then smiled. "Mount Olive Baptist Church. Pastor Thompson has been serving this community for 30 years, and he's never been afraid to speak truth to power. Would he be willing to host a meeting about police misconduct?" Pastor Thompson was part of the civil rights movement back in the day. He understands the importance of community organizing when official channels fail to provide justice. Stephen called Pastor Robert Thompson that evening, explaining the situation and requesting permission to use the church fellowship hall for a community meeting about Officer Ross's pattern of abuse. Pastor Thompson listened carefully to Stephen's account, asked pointed questions about the evidence they'd gathered, and agreed to host the meeting on Friday evening. "Son, I've been waiting for someone to challenge Bradley Ross for years," Pastor Thompson said. "That man has been terrorizing our elderly members every time they have to go to the courthouse, and it's time for the community to stand together and say no more." Pastor Thompson also agreed to help spread word about the meeting through the church's informal communication networks, reaching people who might not respond to official announcements, but who trusted the pastor's judgment about community concerns. By Friday evening, 43 people had gathered in Mount Olive Baptist Church's Fellowship Hall, representing families from throughout the Maple Street neighborhood and the broader Charleston Black community. The attendance included not just Ross's direct victims, but also family members, community leaders, and neighbors who understood that public safety required holding law enforcement accountable for abuse of authority. Stephen had prepared for the meeting with the same systematic attention he brought to military briefings, but he also understood that community organizing required different skills than tactical planning. These weren't soldiers receiving orders. They were citizens deciding whether to risk their own safety and privacy to pursue justice for their community. Luther opened the meeting with a brief account of his own experience with Officer Ross, describing the incident at courthouse security and the medical complications that had followed. His calm, detailed testimony set a tone of dignity and factual precision that encouraged others to share their own stories without sensationalism or exaggeration. One by one, community members stood to describe their encounters with Ross. Clarence Foster spoke about the humiliation of being forced to prove his military service to someone who'd never worn a uniform. Dorothy Jenkins described the invasive search procedures that had violated her dignity and delayed her medical treatment. Vernon Watson explained how confiscation of his walking cane had endangered his physical safety and prevented him from fulfilling his civic obligations. Each testimony added weight to the collective understanding that Officer Ross's behavior represented systematic, rather than random abuse. The pattern was clear, the impact was documented, and the community's patience with institutional inaction had been exhausted. After hearing from Ross's direct victims, Stephen presented his analysis of the evidence they'd gathered and the legal options available for pursuing accountability. He explained federal civil rights laws, stolen valor statutes, and administrative misconduct procedures in language that made complex legal concepts accessible to people without specialized training. The question before us tonight, Stephen concluded, is whether we pursue individual complaints that can be dismissed quietly, or whether we coordinate a community response that demands systematic change. Pastor Thompson stood to address the gathering, bringing 4 decades of community leadership and civil rights experience to bear on the decision the group faced. Brothers and sisters, I've seen what happens when good people stay quiet about injustice, hoping that someone else will speak up, or that problems will solve themselves. Silence enables abuse, and patience without action becomes complicity with oppression. The pastor's words carried the weight of historical experience and moral authority that resonated deeply with community members who'd learned to navigate institutional racism through careful calculation of risks and benefits. But I've also seen what happens when communities come together to demand justice. When people risk their individual safety to protect their collective dignity, change is possible, but only when we're willing to make it happen. The discussion that followed was thoughtful and honest, with community members sharing concerns about retaliation, legal costs, and the emotional toll of challenging law enforcement through public proceedings. But the consensus that emerged was clear. Officer Bradley Ross's abuse had continued for too long, and the community was ready to take collective action to stop it. Mrs. Evelyn Carter made the motion that formalized their decision. I move that this community stand together in support of Luther Gray's complaint against Officer Bradley Ross, and that we commit to providing whatever assistance is necessary to ensure that Ross faces appropriate consequences for his actions. The motion passed unanimously. Stephen then outlined the practical steps that coordinated community action would require. Witnesses would need to provide formal statements that could be used in legal proceedings. Victims would need to document their experiences with medical records and photographic evidence. Community leaders would need to communicate with federal investigators and civil rights organizations that could amplify their concerns. Most importantly, the community would need to maintain unity and mutual support throughout a process that might take months to complete and that would certainly involve challenges from people with significant institutional power and resources. Officer Ross isn't just going to accept accountability quietly, Stephen warned. The department that's protected him for years isn't going to voluntarily admit to enabling his abuse. This fight is going to require sustained effort and collective courage. Clarence Foster, whose military experience gave him credibility on questions of sustained commitment under difficult circumstances, spoke for many community members when he responded, "Son, those of us in this room have been fighting systematic oppression for most of our lives. We understand that justice requires persistence, and we understand that powerful people don't give up their advantages without resistance. But we also understand that some fights are worth having, regardless of how difficult they might be." The meeting concluded with practical assignments and contact information, but also with something more powerful, a sense of shared purpose and mutual protection that transformed individual grievances into collective action. People who'd felt isolated and vulnerable now understood that they were part of a community with the resources and determination to demand accountability from people who'd assumed they could abuse elderly Black citizens without consequences. As community members departed Mount Olive Baptist Church that Friday evening, Officer Bradley Ross was 40 miles away, drinking beer with colleagues and laughing about troublemakers who thought they could challenge law enforcement through complaints and meetings. Ross had no idea that his behavior had just united an entire community against him, or that his victims had found an ally with the skills and resources to make their unity effective. Stephen Gray remained in the fellowship hall after the other community members had left, reviewing notes and planning the next phase of their coordinated response. Pastor Thompson joined him at the table, where they'd organized the evening's discussion. "That was impressive organization for someone who doesn't specialize in community work," Pastor Thompson observed. "Thank you, Pastor. I've learned that most successful operations depend on getting good people to work together toward shared objectives. And what's your assessment of our chances for success?" Stephen looked up from his notes with the kind of confidence that came from years of overcoming obstacles that others considered insurmountable. Officer Bradley Ross has been protected by people who assumed his victims would remain isolated and voiceless. That assumption just became his biggest vulnerability. Pastor Thompson smiled, recognizing the combination of strategic thinking and moral conviction that had driven successful civil rights campaigns throughout American history. "Then I suspect Officer Ross is about to learn some lessons that his training never prepared him for." As Stephen drove home through Charleston's quiet Friday evening streets, he reflected on the transformation he'd witnessed during the community meeting. People who'd felt powerless as individuals had discovered their strength as a collective. Victims who'd been silenced by intimidation had found their voices through mutual support. Officer Bradley Ross had created the very thing that would destroy him, a unified community with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from demanding justice. The community response was no longer a possibility. It was a reality that would reshape everything that happened next. Stephen Gray sat in his rental car outside the Charleston Federal Building at 05:30 hours on Monday morning, waiting for Special Agent Rebecca Martinez of the FBI's Civil Rights Division to arrive for their scheduled meeting. Stephen had requested the appointment through military intelligence channels that bypassed local law enforcement entirely, using federal protocols that guaranteed Martinez would review his evidence without interference from Charleston County Sheriff's Department personnel. The 3 manila folders on Stephen's passenger seat contained information that would permanently alter Officer Bradley Ross's life and career. More importantly, they contained evidence that would expose the institutional systems that had enabled Ross's behavior and force accountability at levels far beyond individual misconduct. Agent Martinez arrived precisely on time, her federal credentials and professional demeanor creating an immediate impression of someone accustomed to handling cases that local authorities preferred to avoid. She reviewed Stephen's military identification and security clearance documentation before agreeing to examine the evidence he'd compiled. "Commander Gray, your request mentioned federal civil rights violations and stolen valor charges. Walk me through what you've discovered." Stephen opened the first folder and laid out a timeline that documented Officer Bradley Ross's pattern of abuse across 8 years of courthouse security employment. Medical records, witness statements, photographic evidence, and security camera footage created a comprehensive picture of systematic civil rights violations that local administrative reviews had consistently ignored. Agent Martinez, Officer Ross has been using his position to terrorize elderly Black citizens during routine courthouse visits. The pattern is deliberate, systematic, and has been enabled by supervisors who've received multiple complaints but chosen to protect Ross rather than investigate his behavior. Aranez examined the documentation with the systematic attention that federal investigators brought to civil rights cases. She noted the professional quality of Stephen's evidence compilation, the legal precision of his witness statements, and the medical documentation that proved physical harm resulting from Ross's actions. This is impressive work, Commander. You've assembled more comprehensive evidence than most attorneys manage to gather for civil rights litigation, but I'm particularly interested in your mention of stolen valor charges. Stephen opened the second folder, revealing documentation that he'd obtained through military personnel databases and public record searches. What emerged was evidence of fraud that went far beyond exaggerating military service. Bradley Ross had completely fabricated a military background that had never existed. Ross has been claiming Marine Corps service since 2010, using fake military credentials to obtain employment preferences, veteran benefits, and social credibility. He lists combat deployments that never happened, military decorations he never earned, and training he never received. Martinez studied the evidence with growing interest. Stolen valor cases required specific documentation that proved both false claims and material benefit from those claims. Stephen had provided exactly that documentation. He's received hiring preferences based on veteran status. Charleston County Sheriff's Department gives preference points to military veterans during recruitment. Ross obtained his courthouse security position through those preferences, using forged military documents that no one verified with actual military records. And he's received federal veteran benefits, VA health care, educational benefits, and housing assistance. Total value over 8 years exceeds $40,000 in fraudulent claims. Martinez made notes on her tablet while calculating the federal charges that Stephen's evidence could support. Stolen valor violations carried serious penalties, but when combined with fraud against federal programs and civil rights violations, the potential consequences became severe enough to ensure that Ross would face meaningful accountability. Commander Gray, why didn't you take this evidence to local authorities first? Because local authorities have been protecting Ross for years, dismissing complaints that clearly documented his pattern of abuse. The Charleston County Sheriff's Department has demonstrated that they're unwilling or unable to hold Ross accountable through administrative procedures, and you believe federal intervention is necessary. Stephen's expression shifted into the focused intensity that appeared when he was explaining tactical necessity to superior officers who needed to understand why conventional approaches would fail. Agent Martinez, Officer Ross isn't just an individual problem. He's a symptom of institutional systems that enable abuse against vulnerable populations. Addressing his behavior through local channels would allow those systems to remain intact and protect the next officer who decides to terrorize elderly citizens. Martinez understood immediately. Federal civil rights enforcement existed precisely because local authorities often failed to protect citizens from abuse by their own personnel. Stephen was requesting federal intervention not just for his father's case, but to disrupt the institutional patterns that had made such abuse possible. What outcome are you seeking? Criminal prosecution for civil rights violations and stolen valor fraud, federal oversight of Charleston County Courthouse security procedures, and systematic review of all complaints against Ross that were previously dismissed without proper investigation. Martinez closed the folders and studied Stephen with the calculating expression that federal agents used when assessing whether civilian complainants understood the implications of the actions they were requesting. Commander Gray, federal civil rights prosecution is a serious matter that creates long-term consequences for everyone involved. Are you prepared for the scrutiny, legal proceedings, and potential retaliation that federal cases typically involve? Agent Martinez, I've spent 15 years eliminating threats to American citizens in hostile territories around the world. I'm fully prepared to eliminate threats to American citizens in Charleston County courthouses. The simple directness of Stephen's statement communicated everything Martinez needed to know about his commitment to pursuing federal action, regardless of the obstacles or opposition they might encounter. I'll need to interview the other victims your father mentioned. They're prepared to cooperate fully with federal investigation. The community meeting I organized last week established coordinated support for whatever federal action you determine is appropriate." Martinez made additional notes, recognizing that Stephen had organized community cooperation with the same systematic thoroughness he'd applied to evidence gathering. Federal civil rights cases were often undermined by victims' reluctance to participate in extended legal proceedings, but Stephen had apparently addressed that challenge before requesting federal intervention. "How quickly can you arrange interviews with the other victims?" "They're available today if you're ready to proceed immediately." Martinez checked her schedule and confirmed that she could begin interviews that afternoon. Stephen's preparation and the quality of his evidence had convinced her that the case warranted immediate federal attention rather than the lengthy preliminary review that typically preceded civil rights investigations. While Stephen was meeting with Agent Martinez, Officer Bradley Ross was arriving for his regular Monday morning shift at Charleston County Courthouse, unaware that his years of protected abuse were about to end through channels he'd never imagined possible. Ross processed routine security screenings with his usual combination of aggressive efficiency and selective harassment, targeting visitors who fit his profile of people who needed to be reminded of their place in the social hierarchy. He was particularly satisfied with his handling of an elderly black woman whose diabetes medication required extra scrutiny and whose respectful compliance suggested appropriate deference to his authority. What Ross didn't notice was the federal surveillance team that had positioned itself throughout the courthouse lobby, documenting his behavior through video and audio recording equipment that captured every interaction with civilian visitors. Agent Martinez had initiated surveillance as soon as Stephen's evidence convinced her that Ross posed an ongoing threat to civil rights that required immediate monitoring. The surveillance team observed Ross's pattern of selective harassment, his use of unnecessary delays and invasive procedures against elderly black visitors, and his casual cruelty toward people who had no resources for resistance. What they documented during 6 hours of observation confirmed everything that Stephen's evidence had suggested about Ross's systematic abuse of authority. At 14:30 hours, Agent Martinez called Stephen with an update that transformed their federal case from possibility to certainty. "Commander Gray, we've observed Officer Ross conducting security screenings for 6 hours today. His behavior confirms the pattern your evidence documented, and we've recorded multiple civil rights violations during routine interactions with courthouse visitors. Are you ready to move forward with federal charges?" "We're ready to move forward immediately. I've contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office and they've agreed to prioritize prosecution based on the evidence you've provided and the violations we've observed today." Stephen felt the satisfaction that came from successful mission completion, the moment when months of planning and preparation resulted in tactical success that eliminated a persistent threat. Officer Bradley Ross had finally encountered resources that exceeded his ability to avoid accountability. "What's the timeline for arrest and prosecution?" "Federal arrest warrant will be issued tomorrow morning. We'll coordinate with courthouse security to ensure that Ross is taken into custody without creating a public incident that might compromise the investigation." "And the other charges?" "Stolen valor prosecution will proceed simultaneously. Veterans Affairs fraud investigation is already underway based on your documentation. We're looking at federal felony charges that carry significant prison time." Stephen thanked Agent Martinez and ended the call with the understanding that Officer Bradley Ross's career in law enforcement would be over by Wednesday morning. But Stephen also understood that Ross's individual accountability was only the beginning of the changes that federal intervention would create. That evening, Stephen drove to Luther's house to share the news that their months of preparation had achieved everything they'd hoped to accomplish through federal action. Luther was sitting on his front porch in the gathering dusk, watching neighborhood children play in the quiet street where he'd raised Stephen and where he hoped to live out his remaining years in peace. The bruising on his shoulder had faded, but his diabetes management still required careful attention to stress levels that spiked whenever he thought about courthouse visits or interactions with law enforcement. "Dad, we need to talk," Stephen said, settling into the porch chair where he'd spent countless childhood evenings listening to Luther's stories about Marine Corps service. and the importance of standing up for people who couldn't protect themselves. Good news, or complicated news. Good news. Federal arrest warrant for Officer Ross will be issued tomorrow morning. He'll be in federal custody by Wednesday on civil rights violations and stolen valor charges. Luther felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. For months, he'd wondered whether his decision to file a complaint would accomplish anything meaningful, or whether Ross would simply continue terrorizing elderly community members while administrative procedures protected him from consequences. How long will he be in prison? Federal civil rights violations carry up to 10 years. Stolen valor fraud adds another 5 years. Veterans Affairs fraud could add additional time. He's looking at potentially 15 to 20 years in federal prison. The severity of Ross's potential sentence reflected the seriousness with which federal authorities treated systematic civil rights violations and fraud against military veterans. Stephen had ensured that Ross would face consequences proportional to the harm he'd inflicted on vulnerable community members over 8 years of protected abuse. What about the other officers who enabled his behavior? Federal investigation will review every complaint that was dismissed without proper investigation. Supervisors who knowingly ignored Ross's pattern of abuse will face their own accountability proceedings. Luther understood that Stephen had achieved more than individual justice for their family. He'd initiated systematic changes that would protect future courthouse visitors from the kind of abuse that Ross had been allowed to inflict with impunity. When will the community know about Ross's arrest? Federal authorities will announce the charges on Wednesday morning after Ross is in custody. The community should understand that their willingness to come forward made federal prosecution possible. Luther thought about the community meeting at Mount Olive Baptist Church, the courage that elderly neighbors had shown in sharing their experiences with Ross's abuse, and the collective determination that had transformed individual grievances into community action. Stephen, I want you to understand something. When that officer pushed me against the courthouse wall, I was thinking about survival, about getting through the incident without making things worse for myself. I never imagined that it would lead to federal prosecution and systematic change. Stephen heard something in his father's voice that reminded him of conversations they'd had when he was young. Moments when Luther had shared lessons about the difference between individual courage and collective responsibility. Dad, you did more than survive that incident. You chose to file a complaint when you could have stayed quiet. You chose to trust your community when you could have handled it alone. And you chose to pursue accountability when you could have accepted injustice. But you made the federal case possible. Without your military training and resources, Ross would still be working courthouse security, still terrorizing people who look like me. Stephen considered his father's observation while thinking about the combination of civilian courage and professional capabilities that had been necessary to overcome the institutional protection Ross had enjoyed for years. Dad, I had the skills to build a federal case, but you had the courage to start the fight that made federal intervention necessary. Both were required, and neither would have been sufficient alone. The conversation between father and son continued into the Charleston evening, touching on themes of individual responsibility and collective action, personal courage and systematic change, the persistence required for justice, and the resources necessary to make that persistence effective. By the time Stephen left Luther's house that Monday evening, Officer Bradley Ross had less than 12 hours of freedom remaining before federal authorities would permanently alter his life through consequences he'd never imagined possible. The strategic strike that Stephen had planned with military precision was about to achieve complete tactical success, eliminating a threat that had terrorized elderly community members for years, while local authorities chose protection over accountability. Federal justice was coming to Charleston County Courthouse, and Officer Bradley Ross was about to discover that some fights create enemies with resources he'd never learned to respect. Officer Bradley Ross arrived at Charleston County Courthouse on Wednesday morning with the same aggressive confidence he'd carried for 8 years, unaware that federal agents were already positioned throughout the building, waiting for the optimal moment to execute his arrest warrant. Ross processed through employee security screening with casual efficiency, nodding to colleagues who had no idea they were witnessing his final morning as a law enforcement officer. At 0847 hours, as Ross began his routine patrol of the courthouse lobby, Special Agent Rebecca Martinez approached from the main entrance, flanked by two federal marshals, whose presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the normally busy public space. "Officer Bradley Ross," Agent Martinez announced in a voice that carried clearly across the marble lobby, "you are under arrest for violation of federal civil rights laws and fraudulent claims regarding military service." The words echoed through the courthouse like a physical force, stopping conversations mid-sentence and drawing the attention of everyone within hearing distance. Lawyers paused in their hurried consultations, court clerks looked up from their administrative tasks, and visitors turned to witness an event that none of them had ever seen before: a uniformed law enforcement officer being placed under federal arrest in the building where he'd terrorized citizens for years. Ross's face shifted through a series of expressions that revealed his complete lack of preparation for this moment. Confusion gave way to disbelief, disbelief to anger, and anger to the desperate calculation of someone suddenly realizing that 8 years of protected abuse had just encountered consequences he'd never imagined possible. "There's been some kind of mistake," Ross stammered, his voice carrying the false confidence of someone who'd grown accustomed to intimidating others but had never learned to handle intimidation directed at himself. "I'm a law enforcement officer. I have immunity for actions taken in the course of my duties." "Mr. Ross," Agent Martinez replied with the patient precision that federal agents used when explaining legal reality to people who'd operated outside it for too long, "you have no immunity for systematic civil rights violations or fraudulent claims regarding military service. You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda warning that followed created a surreal atmosphere in the courthouse lobby as visitors and employees watched a security officer, someone they'd been trained to view as an authority figure, receive the same treatment typically reserved for criminals and suspects. Some people pulled out phones to record the arrest, understanding that they were witnessing a moment of accountability that challenged fundamental assumptions about power and protection within the justice system. Ross's colleagues, the courthouse security officers, who'd laughed at his stories and supported his aggressive behavior toward elderly black visitors, stood frozen in professional confusion. They'd been trained to assist with arrests, but none of their training had prepared them for the arrest of one of their own by federal authorities who clearly viewed courthouse security as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Officer Danny Mitchell, who'd shared countless lunches with Ross and had encouraged his strategy of claiming that Luther Gray had been verbally abusive, stepped forward uncertainly. "Agent Martinez, if there are questions about Officer Ross's conduct, we have internal procedures for addressing those concerns through administrative review." Martinez turned to Mitchell with an expression that communicated exactly what federal authorities thought about internal procedures that had protected Ross's abuse for 8 years. "Officer Mitchell, your internal procedures are part of what's being investigated. I suggest you focus on your own conduct and leave federal law enforcement to federal agents." The rebuke was delivered with enough authority to make Mitchell step back, but also with enough clarity to ensure that every courthouse employee understood that federal investigation would extend beyond Ross's individual behavior to examine the institutional systems that had enabled his pattern of abuse. As federal marshals secured Ross's hands with restraints, Stephen Gray emerged from the crowd of onlookers who'd gathered to witness the arrest. Ross recognized Stephen immediately, the younger man who'd accompanied Luther Gray during their previous courthouse visit, whose military bearing had made Ross slightly uncomfortable, even when he'd assumed Stephen posed no threat to his protected position. "You," Ross said, his voice carrying a mixture of recognition and growing understanding that Stephen had been more than a concerned family member observing courthouse security procedures. Stephen stepped close enough to Ross that their conversation wouldn't be overheard by the crowd of spectators, his voice carrying the controlled intensity of someone who'd spent years eliminating threats to American citizens and was now witnessing the elimination of a threat to his own family. "My name is Commander Stephen Gray, Navy SEAL Team. The man you assaulted last month was my father, Luther Gray, Purple Heart recipient and Marine Corps veteran. You chose the wrong family to victimize." The information settled into Ross's consciousness with devastating clarity. He'd spent 8 years terrorizing elderly black citizens because he'd assumed they were isolated and powerless, people with no resources for resistance or retaliation. Luther Gray hadn't been isolated. He'd been connected to someone with elite military training and federal security clearances, someone with the skills and resources to build a case that local authorities couldn't dismiss or ignore. "You have no idea what you've done," Ross said weakly, as if Stephen's professional response to his father's assault had somehow been inappropriate rather than inevitable. "I know exactly what I've done," Stephen replied. "I've ensured that you'll never hurt another elderly person who looks like my father. I've exposed your stolen valor fraud to federal authorities who take military honor seriously, and I've initiated a federal investigation that will hold accountable every supervisor who enabled your behavior." Ross stared at Stephen with the growing realization that his arrest was only the beginning of consequences that would extend far beyond his individual situation. Federal civil rights prosecution would expose the entire pattern of institutional protection that had made his abuse possible, creating accountability for people who'd assumed their administrative positions made them immune to scrutiny. "Commander Gray," Agent Martinez interrupted, "we're ready to transport the prisoner to federal holding." Stephen nodded to Martinez, then addressed Ross one final time before federal marshals escorted him from the courthouse that had been his protected domain for 8 years. "Mr. Ross, my father taught me that dignity can't be taken from someone who truly possesses it, but honor can be lost by someone who never earned it. You're about to learn the difference." Federal marshals led Ross through the courthouse lobby toward the exit, past the security checkpoint where he'd assaulted Luther Gray, past the metal detectors where he'd humiliated elderly community members, past the marble walls that had witnessed 8 years of systematic abuse that local authorities had chosen to ignore rather than address. The crowd of onlookers included several people who recognized Ross from their own courthouse visits, elderly black citizens who'd been subjected to his harassment and intimidation during routine legal business. Their faces showed not celebration at his arrest, but something deeper, a quiet satisfaction that comes from witnessing justice applied to someone who'd assumed he was beyond its reach. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, who'd been at the courthouse for a follow-up hearing regarding her grandson's case, watched Ross's arrest with particular interest. She'd been the first community member to contact Luther Gray after his assault, the person who'd helped Stephen understand that Ross's abuse affected multiple families rather than just the Gray household. "Luther's boy kept his promise," Mrs. Carter murmured to Dorothy Jenkins, who'd also been victimized by Ross during previous courthouse visits. "He said Officer Ross would face consequences, and he delivered exactly what he promised." As federal marshals loaded Ross into their vehicle outside the courthouse, Detective Captain Pierce Coleman emerged from the administrative building where he'd been meeting with Sheriff's Department officials about damage control strategies for the federal investigation that was expanding beyond Ross's individual case. Coleman had spent 12 years managing internal affairs investigations by protecting officers who made mistakes and minimizing civilian complaints that might create liability exposure for the department. Ross's federal arrest represented exactly the kind of external intervention that Coleman had learned to prevent through administrative efficiency and bureaucratic delay. But Stephen Gray had bypassed every protective mechanism that Coleman typically used to shield officers from accountability, using federal channels that local authorities couldn't control and military resources that civilian administrators didn't understand how to counter. Coleman's phone buzzed with a text message from Sheriff David Patterson. "Emergency meeting. 100 hours. Federal investigation expanding to supervisory review. All internal affairs files under federal subpoena." The message confirmed Coleman's growing understanding that Ross's arrest was only the first consequence of federal intervention that would systematically examine every administrative decision that had protected Ross's pattern of abuse. Coleman's own career was now at risk, along with the careers of every supervisor who'd received complaints about Ross and chosen dismissal over investigation. Inside the courthouse, normal operations resumed with an undercurrent of tension and uncertainty that reflected everyone's awareness that fundamental assumptions about authority and accountability had just been challenged. Court clerks processed paperwork with distracted efficiency, Lawyers conducted their business with frequent glances toward the security checkpoint where Ross had been arrested, and judges maintained their schedules while privately wondering what federal investigation might reveal about courthouse operations they'd assumed were properly managed. Sergeant Maxwell Turner, Ross's immediate supervisor, sat in his office reviewing personnel files with the growing understanding that his administrative decisions regarding Ross's behavior would soon be examined by federal investigators who wouldn't be satisfied with explanations about resource limitations and procedural complexity. Turner had known about Ross's pattern of abuse for years, had received multiple complaints about his treatment of elderly black visitors, and had consistently chosen protection over accountability because addressing Ross's behavior would have required energy and attention that Turner preferred to invest elsewhere. Now Turner's administrative convenience was about to become federal evidence of supervisory negligence that enabled civil rights violations. The internal affairs file that documented Turner's responses to previous complaints about Ross would be subpoenaed as evidence of institutional patterns that had made Ross's systematic abuse possible. At 10:45 hours, Turner received the call he'd been dreading since watching Ross's arrest from his office window. "Sergeant Turner, this is Special Agent Martinez with the FBI Civil Rights Division. I need to schedule an interview regarding your supervision of Officer Bradley Ross and your handling of civilian complaints about his conduct." Turner understood that the interview wasn't a request. It was a notification that he'd become part of a federal investigation that would examine whether his administrative decisions had violated his oath to protect and serve all citizens equally. "Agent Martinez, I'd like to have legal representation present during any interview." "That's your right, Sergeant Turner. But I should inform you that federal investigation has already documented a pattern of complaints about Officer Ross that were dismissed without proper investigation. Your cooperation with our inquiry will be noted in our final report." The implication was clear. Turner could cooperate with federal investigation and possibly minimize his own liability, or he could resist federal inquiry and face the full consequences of his administrative decisions that had enabled Ross's pattern of abuse. After ending the call with Agent Martinez, Turner sat quietly in his office thinking about the career consequences of 12 years spent avoiding problems rather than solving them. He'd joined law enforcement with genuine intentions of serving his community, but he'd gradually learned to prioritize administrative convenience over civilian protection, bureaucratic efficiency over justice. Officer Bradley Ross hadn't been Turner's only problem. He'd been Turner's most visible problem. The subordinate whose behavior consistently created complaints and incidents that required administrative attention. Turner had chosen to protect Ross because addressing his abuse would have required admitting that Turner's supervision had been inadequate for years. Now federal investigation would expose every administrative choice that had prioritized departmental reputation over civilian rights, every complaint that had been dismissed without investigation, every pattern of abuse that had been ignored rather than addressed. Turner opened his desk drawer and pulled out his resignation letter, the document he'd been preparing for months as Ross's behavior became increasingly difficult to protect through administrative procedures. He'd planned to submit the resignation after retiring with full pension benefits, avoiding accountability for supervisory decisions that had enabled systematic abuse. But federal investigation had eliminated the possibility of quiet retirement. Turner's administrative record would be examined by federal authorities, who would determine whether his decisions constituted criminal negligence or merely professional incompetence. Outside Charleston County Courthouse, Stephen Gray stood in the morning sunshine, watching federal marshals transport Bradley Ross toward consequences that would permanently alter his life. The arrest represented successful completion of a mission that had required months of preparation, federal coordination, and community organization. But Stephen also understood that Ross's individual accountability was only the beginning of changes that federal intervention would create throughout Charleston County's justice system. Supervisors who'd enabled Ross's abuse would face their own investigations. Administrative procedures that had protected abusive officers would be reformed under federal oversight, and courthouse security would be restructured to prevent future patterns of systematic harassment against vulnerable populations. Stephen's phone buzzed with a text message from Luther. "Saw the news coverage. Thank you for keeping your promise. "Come home for dinner tonight. Melody's cooking." The message reminded Stephen that their fight for accountability had never been about revenge or punishment. It had been about protection and justice, ensuring that elderly community members could access courthouse services without fear of harassment or assault. Officer Bradley Ross's reckoning was complete, but the broader work of reforming systems that had enabled his abuse was just beginning. 6 months after Officer Bradley Ross's federal arrest, the Charleston County Courthouse had become a fundamentally different place. The changes weren't immediately visible to casual observers. The marble floors still gleamed under fluorescent lighting, the metal detectors still hummed with electronic efficiency, and the flow of lawyers, defendants, and families still created the familiar rhythm of justice in motion. But for people who looked like Luther Gray, people who remembered the anxiety that had once accompanied every courthouse visit, the transformation was profound. The federal trial of Bradley Ross had concluded 3 weeks earlier with convictions on all charges: civil rights violations, stolen valor fraud, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of constitutional protections. Judge Patricia Williams had sentenced Ross to 18 years in federal prison, a term that reflected not just his individual crimes but the systematic nature of his abuse and the institutional protection he'd enjoyed for 8 years. During the sentencing hearing, Luther Gray had been invited to provide victim impact testimony, an opportunity to address both Ross and the broader courthouse community about the lasting effects of systematic harassment and assault. Luther had walked to the witness stand that morning, wearing the same brown jacket he'd worn on the day Ross had shoved him against the courthouse wall, his Purple Heart pin gleaming under the courtroom's bright lights. His testimony had been brief but powerful, delivered with the quiet dignity that had sustained him through months of legal proceedings and community organizing. "Your Honor, when Officer Ross assaulted me 6 months ago, he wasn't just attacking an individual citizen. He was attacking the principle that all Americans deserve equal treatment under law, regardless of their age, race, or apparent vulnerability." His behavior had continued for years because people in positions of authority chose to protect his abuse rather than protect the citizens he was sworn to serve. Luther had paused, looking directly at Ross, who sat at the defendant's table with his head down, unable or unwilling to meet the gaze of the man whose life he'd tried to diminish through systematic cruelty. But Officer Ross's abuse also revealed something important about our community's capacity for justice when citizens are willing to stand together and demand accountability. The young people who recorded his behavior, the neighbors who shared their own experiences, the federal agents who took our complaints seriously, all of them proved that democracy works when good people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Luther's testimony had concluded with words that federal prosecutors later described as the most compelling victim impact statement they'd heard in 20 years of civil rights litigation. "I don't hate Officer Ross, and I don't want vengeance against him, but I do want every person who wears a badge to understand that citizens have dignity that can't be stripped away by uniform or authority, and that our constitutional rights are protected by laws that even law enforcement officers must obey." The courthouse reforms that followed federal investigation had been comprehensive and systematic. New security protocols required video recording of all interactions between security personnel and courthouse visitors. Complaint procedures had been restructured to ensure that civilian grievances were investigated by independent authorities, rather than internal affairs personnel with potential conflicts of interest. And all courthouse security officers were required to complete federal civil rights training that emphasized constitutional protections and professional standards. Most importantly, the federal consent decree that settled the broader civil rights lawsuit had established ongoing oversight that would monitor courthouse operations for the next 5 years, ensuring that the institutional changes would become permanent rather than temporary adjustments that might be reversed when public attention moved elsewhere. Stephen Gray had returned to his deployment schedule 6 weeks after Ross's conviction, confident that the systematic changes he'd helped initiate would protect future courthouse visitors from the kind of abuse his father had endured. But he'd also established ongoing communication with community leaders and federal monitors to ensure that enforcement of the new standards would remain effective. On a Thursday morning in late autumn, Luther Gray approached Charleston County Courthouse for the first time since Ross's trial, walking the same route he'd taken on the day that had transformed his life and his community's relationship with local law enforcement. He was returning to serve as a character witness again, this time for a young woman whose circumstances reminded him of Malik Carter, someone who'd made mistakes, but who deserved to have community members speak for her potential rather than her problems. The courthouse lobby looked identical to Luther's memory, but the atmosphere felt completely different. Security officers processed visitors with professional courtesy and efficiency, without the undertone of harassment and intimidation that had characterized interactions during Ross's tenure. The new personnel had been selected through rigorous screening that included federal background checks and psychological evaluations designed to identify candidates who could distinguish between legitimate security concerns and opportunities for power abuse. Officer James Crawford, a 28-year-old Army veteran who'd been hired as part of the courthouse security reforms, approached Luther as he prepared for routine screening procedures. "Good morning, sir. Thank you for your service," Crawford said, noting Luther's Purple Heart pin and Vietnam veteran cap with genuine respect rather than the skeptical hostility that Ross had displayed toward citizens' military credentials. "Thank you, officer, and thank you for yours," Luther replied, recognizing in Crawford's demeanor the professionalism that should have characterized all interactions between law enforcement personnel and the citizens they served. The security screening proceeded smoothly and respectfully, with Crawford explaining each procedure clearly and ensuring that Luther's diabetes medication was handled with appropriate care and attention. When Luther's insulin kit triggered additional screening protocols, Crawford conducted the necessary examination with medical precision rather than suspicious interrogation, treating Luther's health management tools as exactly what they were, rather than potential security threats. "Mr. Gray, you're all set. Have a good day in court." Luther thanked Crawford and walked through the metal detector with none of the anxiety or apprehension that had characterized his previous courthouse visits. The simple interaction represented everything that federal intervention had accomplished: the transformation of courthouse security from an opportunity for harassment into a genuine public safety function conducted with respect for citizens' dignity and rights. As Luther walked toward courtroom 3, he encountered Mrs. Evelyn Carter and Dorothy Jenkins, community members who'd been part of the group that had demanded accountability for Ross's systematic abuse. They were at the courthouse for different legal matters, but their presence reminded Luther that the changes they'd fought for were benefiting the entire community rather than just individual victims. "Luther, how are you feeling about being back here?" Mrs. Carter asked with the kind of protective concern that had sustained their community through months of organizing and advocacy. "Better than I expected, Evelyn. The new security officers seem to understand that their job is protecting courthouse safety, not intimidating courthouse visitors." Dorothy Jenkins nodded with satisfaction that reflected the community's recognition that their collective action had achieved meaningful change. "My granddaughter had to come here last week for a traffic hearing, and she said the officers were professional and respectful. No harassment, no unnecessary delays, no attitude problems." The conversation among community members was interrupted by the arrival of Special Agent Rebecca Martinez, who'd maintained ongoing contact with Ross's victims throughout the federal investigation and prosecution process. Martinez had become a familiar and trusted figure in the neighborhood, someone who'd proven that federal law enforcement could be responsive to civilian concerns when local authorities failed to provide adequate protection. "Mr. Gray, Mrs. Carter, Mrs. Jenkins." Martinez greeted them with the professional warmth that had characterized her work with the community throughout the federal case. "How are the new courthouse procedures working from your perspective?" "Much better, Agent Martinez," Luther replied. The security screening was professional and respectful, exactly what it should have been all along. Martinez made notes on her tablet, documenting community feedback that would be included in the quarterly reports required by the federal consent decree. The ongoing monitoring process was designed to ensure that courthouse reforms remained effective, rather than deteriorating into previous patterns of abuse once federal attention moved to other priorities. "I'm glad to hear that the changes are working as intended. The federal oversight will continue for several more years, but ultimately the community's willingness to report problems will be the most important factor in maintaining the new standards." Martinez's observation reflected a fundamental lesson that the Ross case had taught everyone involved. Sustainable reform required community engagement and ongoing vigilance rather than temporary intervention followed by passive hope that problems wouldn't recur. Luther spent the morning providing character testimony for the young woman whose case had brought him back to the courthouse, speaking with the same quiet authority and moral conviction that had sustained him through his own legal challenges. His testimony focused on the importance of second chances and community support for people who'd made mistakes but who retained the potential for positive contributions to society. After completing his courthouse obligations, Luther walked to Mount Olive Baptist Church for the weekly community meeting that had continued long after Ross's conviction and sentencing. The meetings had evolved from crisis response to ongoing civic engagement, providing a forum for discussing courthouse experiences, monitoring federal compliance, and addressing other community concerns that required collective action. Pastor Robert Thompson opened the meeting with a prayer of gratitude for the changes they'd witnessed and a commitment to remaining vigilant about the principles they'd fought to establish. Brothers and sisters, 6 months ago we came together to demand justice for Brother Luther and accountability for Officer Ross. Today we gather to celebrate the changes we've achieved and to renew our commitment to protecting the rights that our struggle helped secure. The discussion that followed included reports from community members who'd visited the courthouse since the reforms had been implemented. Their experiences confirmed that the new security procedures were working as intended, with officers conducting their duties professionally and respectfully rather than using their positions to intimidate or harass vulnerable visitors. Clarence Foster, the Vietnam veteran who'd been humiliated by Ross during previous courthouse visits, shared his recent experience with particular satisfaction. "I went to the courthouse last month for jury duty, wearing my veteran cap and my Purple Heart pin. The young officer thanked me for my service, handled my medical equipment with respect, and processed me through security without any problems or delays. It was exactly what courthouse security should be: professional, efficient, and respectful." Similar reports from other community members confirmed that the federal intervention had achieved its intended goals. Courthouse visits were no longer sources of anxiety for elderly Black citizens. Security screening had become routine rather than traumatic, and the institutional culture had shifted from protection of abusive officers to protection of citizens' constitutional rights. Stephen Gray joined the community meeting by video call from his deployment location, providing updates on the ongoing federal oversight and expressing pride in the community's sustained engagement with reform implementation. "Dad, Pastor Thompson, everyone who's made these meetings a priority. What you've accomplished represents democracy at its best. You identified a problem, organized collective action, pursued accountability through appropriate channels, and now you're monitoring implementation to ensure that changes remain effective." Stephen's words carried particular weight because community members understood that their success had required both civilian courage and professional expertise, both local organizing and federal intervention. The combination had proven more effective than either approach would have been independently. "The federal oversight will continue for several more years," Stephen continued, "but ultimately the community's commitment to civic engagement will determine whether these reforms become permanent improvements or temporary adjustments that fade when attention moves elsewhere." Pastor Thompson concluded the meeting with a reflection on the broader lessons that their experience with Officer Ross had taught about justice, community, and the ongoing work of protecting democratic principles. "Brothers and sisters, we learned that individual courage can inspire collective action, that systematic problems require systematic solutions, and that accountability is possible when good people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. But we also learned that achieving justice is only the beginning. Maintaining justice requires constant attention and ongoing commitment." As community members departed Mount Olive Baptist Church that evening, Luther Gray reflected on the transformation that had occurred in their neighborhood and their relationship with local law enforcement. 6 months earlier, courthouse visits had been sources of anxiety and potential humiliation. Today, they were routine civic functions conducted with appropriate respect for citizens' dignity and rights. The changes hadn't eliminated all problems or resolved every issue affecting their community, but they had established important principles about accountability, respect, and the protection of constitutional rights that would benefit future generations. Luther walked home through Charleston's quiet autumn evening, past houses where neighbors had supported his fight for justice, past the church where community organizing had transformed individual grievance into collective action, past the streets where children could grow up with slightly more confidence that uniformed authority would protect rather than threaten their families. At home, Luther found a letter waiting from Stephen, who'd written to commemorate the 6-month anniversary of Ross's conviction and to express his own reflections on what their family's experience had accomplished. "Dad, when Officer Ross assaulted you 6 months ago, he thought he was dealing with an isolated elderly citizen who had no resources for resistance or retaliation. What he discovered was that he'd attacked a man whose family included someone with the skills and determination to ensure that abuse would never happen again. But more importantly, he discovered that he'd attacked a man whose community included people with the courage to stand together and demand accountability when their neighbors were threatened." Stephen's letter continued with observations about the broader implications of their successful fight against systematic abuse. "The reforms at Charleston County Courthouse will protect thousands of citizens who will never know that their rights were secured by your willingness to file a complaint and our community's willingness to support accountability. That's the real measure of what we accomplished, not just justice for our family, but protection for families we'll never meet." Luther carefully folded Stephen's letter and placed it in the wooden box where he kept important family documents and photographs. The letter would join Margaret's final birthday card, Stephen's military commendations, and the Purple Heart citation that had been his own recognition for service to principles larger than individual interests. Outside, Charleston settled into the comfortable rhythm of an evening. In a city where citizens could visit their courthouse without fear of harassment, where law enforcement accountability had been established through community action, and where the promise of equal justice under law had been reinforced through the combined efforts of ordinary people who'd refused to accept systematic abuse as inevitable. Officer Bradley Ross was serving his federal prison sentence in a facility 800 miles away, learning to navigate institutional hierarchy as someone without power rather than someone who abused it. The courthouse security officers who'd replaced him and his colleagues were conducting their duties with professionalism that honored both their law enforcement responsibilities and their obligation to protect citizens' constitutional rights. And Luther Gray was preparing for sleep in the house where he'd raised a son who'd learned to protect American citizens anywhere they faced threats to their safety and dignity, including threats that came from people who wore badges and claimed authority to abuse rather than serve. The new standard had been established, tested, and proven effective. Justice had been achieved not through revenge or retaliation, but through systematic accountability that protected current victims while preventing future abuse. In Charleston County Courthouse, dignity was no longer a privilege that could be stripped away by uniform or authority. It was a right that was protected by laws, monitored by community engagement, and enforced by federal oversight that would continue until respect for all citizens became the permanent foundation of public safety, rather than a temporary reform that might be forgotten when attention moved elsewhere. The work of democracy had been completed, and the results would endure for generations who would never know the names of the people who'd fought to secure their rights, but who would benefit from the courage of citizens who'd refused to remain silent when their neighbors were threatened by those who'd sworn to protect them. Each share, each comment, each like helps ensure that stories of accountability and transformation reach people who need to see that change is possible, that dignity under pressure can create lasting progress. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. Take a second, leave a comment. Every comment and share helps us reach someone who might be feeling invisible right now. If this story meant something to you, please like, share, and subscribe. It keeps us going. It helps us shine a light on voices that have too often been ignored. And most of all, it reminds us and others that these stories matter, that your voice matters,